Okay, picture this. It's the absolute height of the Cold War. Global tensions are sky high, and the threat of nuclear annihilation is just, well, it's a daily reality for everyone. But here is the craziest part. One of the most terrifying, deeply unsettling plots from this entire era wasn't drafted by Soviet spies. No, it was meticulously planned by the highest-ranking generals inside the United States military. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a classified file that sat hidden in the dark for over 30 years. We are looking at a literal blueprint for manufacturing a war. So it's March of 1962. A top-secret document lands right on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Now, at first glance, it had all the standard, boring markings you'd expect. The routing codes, the formal letterhead from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But beneath all that dry, bureaucratic language was a proposal so extreme, it honestly almost defies belief. It was a fully fleshed-out campaign of sabotage, psychological warfare, and outright violence. And the intended scapegoat for all of this? Fidel Castro's Cuba. The military essentially wanted to go to war, but they desperately needed an excuse. Which forces a seriously chilling question, right? What exactly drives a military establishment, an institution literally sworn to protect its citizens, to even consider targeting its own people? I mean, how does a massive organization reach a point where basic moral and legal boundaries are just completely suspended? Well, to really understand this, we have to look at the immense, almost suffocating pressure these planners were dealing with at the time. The geopolitical pressure cooker had been boiling over for years. In 1959, Castro takes over Cuba, which is, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's right there. Then, in 1961, the CIA completely botches the Bay of the Pigs invasion. It was this humiliating, highly public failure on the world stage, and it honestly only made Castro look stronger. So by 1962, the Pentagon was basically consumed by institutional paranoia. They felt direct military intervention was the absolute only solution left. But they knew they couldn't just invade without accidentally triggering World War III with the Soviets. The psychological desperation in that room was palpable. So what do? Well, their solution was cold, it was calculated, and it was deeply deceptive. They decided on a false flag operation. The logic was shockingly simple. If the United States couldn't find a legitimate, politically acceptable reason to invade Cuba, they were just going to completely fabricate one from scratch. They wanted to manufacture a crisis so severe and so emotionally charged that the American public would practically be demanding retaliation. The actual playbook for this, Operation Northwoods, reads like a dystopian movie script. They proposed staging bombings in civilian areas of Washington, D.C. and Miami. But wait, it actually gets wilder. Remember, this is 1962, but they were planning to sink a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay using remote-controlled drones. Decades before Predator drones were even a normal thing in warfare, these guys were conceptualizing unmanned vessels just to pull off false flags. They even planned to orchestrate fake commercial airplane hijackings using decoy passengers and staged distress calls. They wanted to blow up decoy boats filled with supposed Cuban refugees, all just to paint Castro as an absolute monster. It was a masterclass in dark psychological manipulation. But honestly, here is the absolute most disturbing detail of the entire document. Buried right there within the clinical, boring administrative language was the explicit acknowledgement that innocent American citizens could, and very likely would, be killed in the crossfire. They knew everyday people would die, and they were completely fine with it. It was simply viewed as an acceptable cost of doing business to achieve their geopolitical goals. Let that sink in for a second. The men who wrote this didn't see human beings. They just saw a statistical variable. It was this purely utilitarian approach to life and death. They viewed the very people they swore to defend simply as pawns, ready to be sacrificed on a global chessboard. It reveals a terrifyingly cold, detached bureaucracy operating right there in the shadows of the Pentagon. So, how were they actually going to pull this off? The mechanics were terrifyingly thorough. First, they'd stage the violent incidents. Next, they'd plan false evidence. We're talking forged documents, Soviet weapons left at the scene, just to ensure Cuba took the fall. Then came the media manipulation, using fake radio broadcasts and sympathetic journalists to really amplify public hysteria. The ultimate endgame here was to weaponize the fear of the everyday American, backing the president into a corner where military retaliation was the only option left. It was a systematic pipeline designed to turn public trauma into a mandate for war.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this was probably just some rogue, low-level intelligence agents going off script, right? Actually, no, that is the most shocking part. These were seasoned, highly decorated military professionals. The architects included General Lyman Lemnitzer, the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This was a fully vetted, meticulously structured proposal that passed through the highest, most elite layers of military leadership. It exposes this massive, dangerous disconnect between military planners and the democratic principles they swore to uphold.
And this brings us to a massively dramatic historical showdown. Operation Northwoods eventually makes its way onto the desk of President John F. Kennedy. So on one side, you have the military establishment absolutely convinced that the ends justify the means. And on the other side, you have JFK, a president who was already badly burned by the military's disastrous advice during the Bay of Pigs. He firmly believed that moral and legal boundaries must hold, no matter how intense the Cold War got.
Kennedy took one look at this thing and vetoed it immediately. He saw the profound ethical and legal violations in this proposal, rejected it outright, and ordered its complete termination. He drew a hard line in the sand, asserting that civilian oversight and moral restraint were absolutely non-negotiable, period. Instead of all this insane deceit, Kennedy pivoted the U.S. strategy toward a very different path. He chose diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and multilateral efforts to deal with Castro. It was a strategy of containment and patience, rather than manufactured escalation. And man, it's a really good thing he did, because that diplomatic restraint would be critically tested just a few short months later during the very real, very terrifying Cuban Missile Crisis. So what happens after JFK kills the operation? The Pentagon goes into full-blown damage control. For over 30 years, this explosive, terrifying document was quietly shelved and buried deep in classified military archives. 30 years. It was kept entirely hidden from the public eye. And you know exactly why. Because the military and intelligence communities knew that if the American people found out they had literally planned to terrorize their own citizens, their institutional credibility would be destroyed overnight. It actually wasn't until a major push for government transparency in the 1990s that this secret finally saw the light of day. Thanks to the 1992 JFK Assassination Records Act, there was this massive review of Cold War documents. And finally, in 1997, Operation Northwoods was completely declassified. When it hit the media, it forever shattered our assumptions about the lengths institutions will go to justify conflict. It proved that sometimes the absolute most unbelievable conspiracy theories actually have a terrifying basis in reality. Which brings us right to today. Look, we might not be worried about the government faking a ship sinking in the Caribbean anymore, but the core playbook of Operation Northwoods, that is alive and well. Just think about modern information warfare. We've got cyber operations, digital disinformation campaigns, algorithmic manipulation right there on your social media feeds. The desire to manipulate public perception by manufacturing narratives and exploiting our fears is way more sophisticated now than it ever was in the 60s. The battlefield has literally just moved from the streets to our screens. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought here. In an era completely dominated by digital disinformation, deepfakes, and cyber warfare, how safe are we really from the manipulation of our own institutions? I mean, if they were willing to go this far back in 1962, what constraints are truly holding them back today? I really want to hear your thoughts on this, so definitely sound off in the comments below. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the narrative.